Welcome to the American Maritime Podcast. We appreciate you being here. If you're new to the podcast, we talk about the issues that matter to the 650,000 men and women working in the domestic maritime industry. We want to thank the American Maritime Partnership for making this podcast happen and for being the voice of these hardworking Americans. Not only do they move critical goods between American ports, but they are the eyes and ears of these same ports and our waterways. As we've seen during the pandemic, American maritime mariners rise to the occasion when our country needs them most. I'm Sara Fuentes, Secretary-Treasurer of the American Maritime Partnership, and I'll be your host today. We have a very special guest, Mr. Jason Atwell. Jason is the Principal Advisor of Global Intelligence at Mandiant, the global leader in dynamic cyber defense and response. Jason has over 17 years of experience in cyber and risk intelligence from across the military, government, and commercial sectors. As a senior intelligence enablement consultant, Jason contributes to the intelligence used by many of the world's top governments and commercial entities to defend against targeted attacks. Jason also serves as an intelligence officer in the U.S. Army Reserve. Welcome, Jason. We are very pleased to have you with us today.
No, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Before we get started, let's learn a little bit more about you. Why did you decide to get into cybersecurity?
So interestingly enough, I actually got into cybersecurity kind of by accident, but I'm glad I did because it is a really interesting field. But as you mentioned, my background was in intelligence before I was ever in cybersecurity. And so luck of the draw early on in my military career, some of the assignments I had involved command and control analysis and tracking infrastructure and things like that. And so I learned a lot about communication networks, how they function, which obviously in this day and age leads directly to computers and cybersecurity. And so once I kind of got introduced to that, it was just a matter of sticking with it because it's a fast-paced field. It's a really interesting field, and I think it's one that does a lot of good because there's not very many entities left at all, if any, that aren't touched by this problem set. Not least of which certain key industrial and economic sectors.
Yeah, for sure. That sounds really interesting. It sounds like you've had a really colorful career that gave you a lot of insight to some different aspects. Yeah. So what is it about critical infrastructure and maritime in particular that really interests you?
So yeah, I work mostly with government clients most of the time, but critical infrastructure is an interesting one, and especially things like maritime ports, because when you deal with government clients enough, you learn a lot about sort of how I'll call it the hard side of the government is structured. So your actual government entities, how the DoD does things, how DHS does things. But you also become keenly aware of the fact that, and it's a bit of an obvious statement, but a lot of America's power lies in its economic base, and not least of which are those sort of dual use entities that touch both the private sector economy, but also our ability to project military power, our national security enterprise. And so when you touch on things like ports, you've got these kind of critical nodes that connect the government to private sector, and without them, certain functions can't be performed. And so not just you look at COVID-19 and the economic impacts, but then also things like the current crisis in Ukraine, a port becomes doubly important because it not only keeps our economy running, but it affects our ability to do things like move tanks overseas or supply troops in the field with, the necessary things like fuel and things like that. So I've been doing a lot of, I guess, thinking about maritime in particular because it does play so many roles when it comes to being able to perform other government functions and missions.
That's so well said. The ports really do a lot for our country, and that's a really interesting way to think about that. And speaking of ports, I read a piece that you wrote in Maritime Executive last month entitled "Now is the time to take port cybersecurity seriously." Can you tell us a bit about what motivated you to write that, especially at this time?
Yeah, I mean, there's no time like a crisis, as everyone knows. But we started tracking this issue in the Ukraine way back because this started becoming a problem in terms of the cyber threat environment and in what where it was leading way before it actually went kinetic last week. And so there was a lot of thought being put around, we're already under pressure. We already have clients that have all kind of issues with supply chain and their security and the resources that are available during economic contractions and things like that. And it's like as if things weren't bad enough, now we've got another crisis on the horizon before the previous one has fully been able to be sorted out. And so to me, it was kind of an obvious, like, hey, we're in a tough situation, but it's not too late to start to think about, if this crisis drags out, if it becomes more confrontational directly between Russia and the United States, what are we doing to make sure that we're as resilient as possible in the face of that situation? And so, I just I won't pretend that it's a super complex piece that answers any questions, but just kind of throwing a flag out there to say, hey,
this is something we should pay attention to.
It's like we're learning a lot about, in the average American in ways they probably weren't previously. Is the word supply chain is now a household phrase. And so it's like, okay, we've got everyone's attention. Let's do something with it. So it really just an attempt to frame that up and say, hey, it's not too late. Like there's stuff we can do.
Well, that's a relief to hear that it's not too late and that there's still action that can be taken. Let's dig in more a little bit about the risk of cyber attacks on America's ports and supply chain. You mentioned Ukraine. Do you think this crisis in Ukraine has the potential to create cyber issues in the maritime sector here in the United States?
Yeah, because we're dealing with one of, if not the most capable cyber adversaries in Russia. They've got themselves into a situation where they're going to be looking for more and more options to try to either achieve their goals or be able to save face and extricate themselves from that situation. It remains to be seen what that's going to mean. The cyber activity that we've seen around that situation has been, I won't call it, overly limited, but it's not been maybe as aggressive as some analysts might have expected. It also has been mostly contained in Eastern Europe. But we've got as everyone knows with all the talk around sanctions that's been in the media, there's an economic aspect of this that we're not used to in terms of the wars we've been involved in over the last couple decades. And so I think there's definitely the potential there, especially if Russia again starts looking for new ways to capitalize or try to pull themselves out of a tough situation. So one of the easiest ways for them to do that would be to inflict the pain on our economy that we're inflicting on theirs. And an obvious place to start with that would be the shipping industry, because if nothing moves, then everybody is equally harmed by that. Rather than go directly at, say, the energy sector or manufacturing or aerospace, just degrade their ability to move their supplies and their finished products around. We've also seen, the Black Sea is a major component of what's going on in the Ukraine, and so you see that, the oil and gas industry, the pipelines in Ukraine are a huge part of this, and so they're heavily relying on ports to be able to function. And so if they're taking notes or they already have an idea of how they would cause havoc, that's an obvious place for them to start. We've seen that, in the past, opportunistic ransomware attacks have affected ports, and so there's your proof of concept. If it can be done in an opportunistic fashion, taking advantage of a situation, why can't it be done deliberately to further exacerbate the same situation? And so I don't know if you want to transition and kind of like, okay, that sounds awful. What do we do about it? But like I said, we know a lot about Russian cyber tactics, techniques, and procedures from watching them for many, many years. And so the good news side of all this is that there are a lot of things you can do to at least harden yourself, because it may not be a matter of if, it may be a matter of when Russia does certain things. But being resilient, being able to continue to function even if you do experience malicious Russian cyber activity, that's really the name of the game, because you can't defend everything all the time. But if you've got a complex network, or you've got legacy systems with newer systems overlaid, or you've got a complex supply chain, there's things you can do to start to identify places you can place your resources to make sure that your cybersecurity posture is as good as can be in a terrible situation.
that sounds very, very scary, but good to know that there's stuff you can do about it. I noticed in a lot of your writing, you talked about the difference between, resiliency versus risk assessment. Could you talk a little bit about that too?
Yeah, because it's not enough just to identify risks. I mean, risk management a lot of times ends up being a paper drill where you're like, okay, I'm aware that I have a risk here and I've documented it for the inspection that's coming up next quarter. It's another thing to say I've truly mitigated that risk based on the threat environment as it exists. Intelligence plays a huge role in being able to do that. Being able to monitor your network, understanding your attack surface, not just knowing what the risk is, but at what scale it exists on your network. These are very important things. And I think that also, it might sound simplistic, but it also, communication plays a huge role in that, because if it's one thing for the CISO or the IT staff to be aware of something, it's another thing for it to be communicated up and down the chain so that in a crisis, people are aware of, where are our sort of weak links, or where are the most likely places we might see an issue, even if it's something as simple as, spear phishing that takes, uses a Ukraine theme to lure me into clicking a link or something like that. All of those things play a role in actually managing the risk, which in my mind is the end result, is that you're more resilient than just, like I said, we've recognized this, right, or we bought this and we know that it's that in order to use it, we're incurring a certain amount of risk. But okay, if that's the case and you have to go down that path because of a corporate mandate or government regulation, how do you make sure that you've got controls in place that allow you to continue to operate when that's degraded, or to put other controls in place that prevent, if that technology is compromised, it doesn't spread to the wider enterprise and things like that.
Sounds like there's something for everyone to do at every level to really fight this.
I mean, there really is. I mean, and it might sound like a cliche, especially to anybody that works in information security, but it's, the user also always plays a role. You have to do what you can to save them from themselves, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't also, spend some time on your training and awareness program. Don't be afraid to communicate to your workforce, because everyone's very busy these days, especially. And so, and this isn't a criticism, but not everyone's even aware of what's going on in the world. Not everyone reads the news to the level that some of the folks here, especially in DC, do, or that I get paid to do. And so it's an awareness of the fact that the ocean isn't necessarily a buffer in the way that it used to be. There might be a crisis in Ukraine, but it could also end up being a crisis in our own, maritime infrastructure as well. Either deliberately or just because, some hacktivist group is taking advantage of the situation because you're more likely to pay a ransom in a crisis, things like that.
Wow. And so looking at overall defenses, how would you assess the cybersecurity defenses at U.S. ports compared to other critical infrastructure?
I mean, it's really tough to compare industries like that, especially when you look at the maritime sector, which to my mind is not just the maritime sector. You've got aviation nearby that comes into these ports. You've got the railheads. You've got the pipelines. You've got the manufacturing base that relies on it. It's sort of an umbrella sector in a lot of ways, and so that's what makes it really tricky to define that, because they've got all the vulnerabilities that everyone else does. It's like a compounded situation, and that's not to make it sound scary again, but it requires, to my mind, a much greater awareness of the complexity of the threat environment than other sectors might, because there are so many more entry points into a port than there might be into other types of economic entities. And so the way I would answer that question is by saying that, it depends, and that's why it requires some study. A West Coast port might have different considerations than an East Coast port. A port near a military base has different considerations than one that's mostly commercial, or a very small port that mostly caters to like the fishing industry or oil and gas. I've spoken at a couple different maritime and port authority conferences, and the range of different types and problem sets, and everything from like New York, New Jersey with thousands of employees and a huge amount of activity to a small port in the Gulf that just does oil and gas or whatever. It's hard to compare, because some of these ports have peers and others don't, and in some cases it's a matter of 1 minute there is no cyber threat, and the next minute it shoots up to a massively elevated level because of some situation going on where, Russia's angry because they can't sell their gas anymore. Right. And so I know I kind of skirted all around that question, but it's, I think that the root of the question is not so much how are we prepared, it's what can we do to be prepared. And I think that starts at looking at the threat environment. And then you can go from there to understand, okay, now here's my IT posture. Here is the capabilities of malicious actors out there. How do I put as much distance between myself and those as possible, and then be prepared to deal with what's left?
So we've talked a lot about ports and kind of how they can affect so many different aspects. And how kind of wide and far-reaching the maritime industry is. So in addition to ports, have you identified other areas within the maritime industry that are vulnerable and that should be alert for cybersecurity threats?
Yeah, I think if I had to pick a couple, one I would go with anywhere it overlaps with energy, because that's become that's where the tension exists right now when it comes to especially the current situation, also with some of the supply chain issues that are out there. So that's one that I would say. If you're a port that deals heavily with the energy sector, you're doubly kind of in the crosshairs. The other would be this emerging area with all the operational technology that's being put out there. So the autonomous ships, all the different networked cameras and monitoring and industrial control system and that stuff. It produces an entirely new aspect of the attack surface that you might have. So not only do you have your traditional network computers and maybe legacy technology, now you've got all these different systems that are supposed to lend themselves to greater efficiency, but that also are additional entry points into your network for for a while there it was that there wasn't a lot of malware, there weren't a lot of capabilities that targeted this. That's not the case anymore, especially when you look at more advanced actors. Oddly enough, this is an area the Iranians have looked at a lot because, there's been incidents with their ICS in the past, and so they've started to look at that as sort of fair game. They've launched attacks on things like local utilities and things like that, and so that's where network inventories, being able to continuously monitor your technology, pulling back from not just your firewall, but like if something's in, how do I detect it quicker? That's where stuff like that becomes a key consideration.
Interesting. And so we were talking a little bit earlier too about how now people think about the supply chain more than they did before. Does that apply to these kind of hacktivists and bad actors as well? Are they now seeing the supply chain as a new place to kind of attack a new vulnerability?
Yeah, I think it does in two ways. One is I don't think people understand the extent to which code that underlies a lot of software comes from all over the place. Interestingly enough, Ukraine was known for having sort of a third-party cottage coding industry where larger companies would outsource coding for their well-known products to places like that. So that creates kind of two exposures. You've got one, which is, are there any insider threat considerations around who's working on that code? Are they moonlighting? Are they selling code on the side to bad actors? But then also an awareness among adversaries that rather than come right at a big vendor in the United States or a government entity in the United States, I can infiltrate the supply chain further downstream, and I can maybe put some malware or some bad code in the stuff when it's being developed elsewhere. And so by the time it ends up in the larger product suite or at the place where it was being sold or shipped to, I'm now undetected because I got in way earlier than would have been difficult to do later on. I know that's a broad answer, but that's just, to me, it speaks to the absolute complexity of the environment we're in, and it grows more complex by the day, which is why basics matter more than ever. Testing code, pre-deployment, being able to monitor that code. There's a lot of talk in DC lately about zero trust. A lot of corporate entities have looked at that as well. It's a worthy goal, but I don't know that there's been enough discussion about what that truly means. The way we do risk management, as you mentioned earlier, That doesn't line up very well with zero trust because zero is zero. So it doesn't mean, all right, I'm going to have 2% trust for certain things that have been on the network for a long time or new things that I trust for some reason. It requires you to be able to continuously monitor, to be able to feed in real-time threat intelligence that takes into account emerging issues with existing technologies. Yeah.
Interesting. Trust no one. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it really, if you're a CISO or a CIO, you have to have a healthy level of suspicion of what's going on your network all the time.
So talking a little bit about response, the Coast Guard has been increasing its resources for American Maritime to stay safe from threats. Can you tell us a little bit more about these programs? Do you think it's enough?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that the government is doing a much better job than maybe a decade or so ago to make a lot of different resources available to companies. Unfortunately, a lot of those at this stage are still, regulations and frameworks that are just, these are things you should do. And that's not to, disparage those as not worthwhile. But what's difficult is they do require resources to implement. It's one thing to know that a framework exists or that best practices exist. One thing I think that the industry can do more is really actually reach out. Like when the Coast Guard puts things in, and there is a large section of the Coast Guard's web presence that is now cybersecurity oriented, resources that are available to industry, and including hotlines that can be called in the event of certain types of incidents and things. And so, and this might be more obvious to some than others, but it is a two-way communication channel. I've spoken to the Coast Guard recently. I've spoken to DHS. I've spoken to the Department of Transportation. They really do want industry to reach out and let them know, like, hey, that regulation, it works here, it doesn't work here, or I need resources to make that work. Can you tell me more about what my peers are doing? So, the government role, I think that the government's getting better at realizing that it's one thing to secure the government. It's another thing to secure the industry that the government relies on to be able to perform certain functions, as I mentioned early on. But then also an awareness that private sector entities such as my own, Mandiant, play a huge role too in bridging that gap because there's only so much the government can share in certain situations. There's only, the government, despite the way it resources problems, they can't always send someone to help, everyone either. So knowing how to use private sector cybersecurity to bridge the gap between government priorities and private sector needs. I think, and that's why it's been good to hear a lot from places like the Coast Guard. I spoke recently with the CG5, sorry, Admiral Mauger. And so, these guys are spending a lot of time thinking about this and how do we use our roles and our powers to really help the private sector. And so what I would say to that really is, it's the simple answer, but spend the time to look those up or reach out to somebody who can to point you towards those resources, and then really try to use them, test them out, contact those organizations, look through that documentation, compare it to what you're getting from your security vendors, and hold them accountable too, and say, hey, the Coast Guard says I should do this. What kind of threat intel do you have that can compare that to my actual enterprise? And really thinking through that now so that if this crisis, for instance, in Ukraine drags on for months and Russia, continues to escalate, you've prepared yourself for what those scenarios might look like as compared to those various data points.
Very interesting. So long term, what countries do you think represent the primary cyber threats to the United States? Or is it non-state actors?
Yeah, I think the non-state actors thing is important to keep in mind because there is sort of a proliferation aspect of the cyber threat environment as well that is increasingly an issue. Things that used to be very difficult for non-state actors to achieve or for smaller nations that we might not think of as threats to achieve, that's a sort of given that doesn't hold up as much. There are more and more emerging nation states that are more and more interested in what cyber can do for them because they see how successful countries like China, Russia, Iran, North Korea have been in using malicious cyber activity to achieve their national goals without having to resort to traditional espionage or direct conflict. To backtrack a tiny bit to the first part of that, everyone's focused on Russia right now for obvious reasons. that is not to say that no one's looking at China, but it's always important to remember that China is still out there. China, in some ways, has met and surpassed the capabilities of Russia. They used to kind of always be the perpetual number two. But I think that, especially given what we're seeing about, I guess, the hollowness of certain Russian capabilities in terms of their military performance and the lack of aggressive cyber activity we've seen so far, we might be finally seeing a situation where China, surpasses Russian capabilities and threat levels because they watch situations like this just like anyone else, and they take notes on what works and what doesn't work. It's also worth noting that they are much more of an economic competitor with the United States than Russia is. The stuff that we're inflicting on Russia in terms of economic pain right now are not things we can do to China because our economies are way too interlinked. Right. But that's also a kind of a scary, most dangerous scenario to talk through, because what if we are in a similarly heated confrontation with China? What would they be willing to do to bring that conflict to a close to their advantage as quickly as possible that Russia's not able to do? And then I would be remiss not to mention the other two of the big four, which are Iran and North Korea. We've seen North Korea kind of saber rattling with their missile program lately because they're upset they're not getting as much attention. But they have a significant cyber capability. It's mostly focused on criminal activity, but they also have some destructive capabilities. They also have less to lose than some of these other countries because they don't have the economic and diplomatic relationships. And that goes for Iran as well. When you're already persona non grata in most of the countries on Earth, you don't have to worry as much about messing with their infrastructure. And as I mentioned, Iran, because of their sort of ideological mindset, they're willing to do things that other countries aren't. And so I know that 4 might seem like a lot, but those are the 4 you always have to think about. But there are other countries, again, that the bar to entry is not as low as it used to be, or there are sort of exchanges that take place between some of these countries. If you look at like the UN vote as to who condemned Russia and who didn't, it's worth noting that some of those countries that weren't willing to condemn Russia are also ones that have nascent malicious cyber programs. And so this environment is only going to get more complex. It's sort of, you could use analogies around, who got the first military airplanes, and then a few years later you had everybody wanted them because they were useful. Nuclear proliferation also is not an unuseful comparison, because once one country has it, the rivals that in their region and globally, they're going to want it as well. And some of this stuff is commodity at this point. You can get malware pretty openly that serves different functions. Some of the more advanced threat groups, Russia, China, they mix in open source malware with custom malware. And so there's no shortage of reporting on this. And just as it's useful for defenders, it can be useful for adversaries to develop their toolkits as well.
Well, that was terrifying. Thank you. I think we're all a little scared straight from this, and hopefully take your good advice about developing resiliency in our market.
Yeah, I mean, I'll use the goofy phrase, we scare because we care, because we spend all our time in the threat environment. And so we know what's out there, but we also know how you can go about mitigating a lot of this stuff. And so it may seem overwhelming, but you can pick a start point and you can start to address these things. I mean, the industry is very mature. The industry has a lot of resources available. And so it's never too late to start to address this stuff.
It's good to hear. Before we close off this episode of American Maritime Podcast, do you have anything you'd like to share about your work for our listeners, or anything that we didn't touch on that you think they need to hear?
I mean, we covered a lot of ground, and the questions were excellent. I don't, if I would say anything that's important for right now, is that we are potentially in the very early stages of this, which is good and bad news. The bad news is it means that this could get uglier and this could drag out for a while, and we might see Russia, move from Europe into, Western Europe and then further over and maybe even target our own infrastructure with their cyber capabilities. But like I said, the good news is because we are in the early phases, and because Russia is seemingly on its back foot right now and not necessarily being as aggressive as they might be able to, there's stuff that can be done. We know a lot about Russian TTPs and capabilities. A lot of the stuff that they are doing is stuff that is a mix of old and new, and so it can be addressed. And then also I would like to just say that I've been very happy and excited to hear the maritime industry is spending so much time thinking about cybersecurity, because it's a, like I said, it is a overlapping part of so much of the economy. And if you look at history, in past conflicts, it was all about being able to supply your armies. It was all about being able to keep your home front supplied. It was about leveraging economic power, and ports were always front and center of that. So we're back in a situation where we're dealing with an adversary that is both capable and motivated to disrupt those types of activities in a way that we've not had to experience in a long time. And so it's all hands on deck right now. And there is help available, and we're in a situation where Russia played its hand in such a way that they gave us a heads up that things are getting ugly, and we can do something about it.
Jason, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your expertise. It has been so nice to learn more about these threats and to learn what the domestic maritime industry should do to take action on these. We're very grateful for your time. That is all for this episode of American Maritime Podcast. We thank you for tuning in and encourage you to share it with others that also care about American maritime. I'm Sara Fuentes, and this is the American Maritime Podcast, signing off.